There is something about America's national parks that most of us never think about. We see the postcards, the sweeping views and towering pines, the promise of adventure and fresh air. But hidden beneath that beauty is something far more unsettling. Over the decades, hundreds of people have walked into these protected wildernesses and simply ceased to exist. No bodies, no trails, no answers, just silence. And the deeper you dig into these cases, the stranger and more inexplicable they become. So settle in, relax, and let me take you through some of the most haunting and deeply unsettling disappearances in national park history. The Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina are the most visited national park in the entire United States, drawing over 12 million visitors a year who come for the misty ridgelines, the wildflower meadows, and the old-growth forests that seem to go on forever in every direction. But the Smokies have a darker reputation among those who pay attention. Over the decades, several people have walked into this park and never walked out. And one of the most chilling cases happened over half a century ago on a sunny Father's Day weekend in 1969. Dennis Lloyd Martin was 6 years old, just 6 days shy of his 7th birthday, and he was on a camping trip in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park with his father William, his grandfather Clyde, and his 9-year-old brother Douglas. It was a family tradition, one that brought the Martins from their home in Knoxville out into the wild backcountry of the Smokies every Father's Day. They had hiked from Cades Cove, one of the park's most popular destinations, up to a grassy clearing in the mountains called Russell Field, where they camped the first night. The next day, June 14th, the family continued east along the Appalachian Trail for about 90 minutes until they reached Spence Field, a wide-open bald at nearly 5,000 feet of elevation, where the views stretched for miles in every direction. At Spence Field, the Martins ran into another family, and the children from both groups quickly hit it off. Late in the afternoon, around 4:30, the boys hatched a plan. They would sneak into the woods, split up, and then jump out to surprise the adults. Dennis's brother Douglas and 2 other boys headed south and west into the tree line, while Dennis, wearing a bright red t-shirt, went northwest, disappearing behind a bush at the edge of the meadow. A few minutes later, the other 3 boys came bounding out of the woods, laughing. But Dennis was not with them. His father William called out. Minutes went by, then more minutes. And then a terrible silence settled over Spence Field as the realization set in that Dennis was gone. William Martin would later describe the terror of those first few minutes. He immediately called out for Dennis, his voice cutting through the warm afternoon air. When there was no answer, he began walking, then jogging, west along the Appalachian Trail for about a mile to a spot called Little Bald, scanning the tree line and calling his son's name over and over. He doubled back, hoping Dennis would be at the campsite when he returned. He was not. What followed was the largest search and rescue operation in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Within hours, park rangers mobilized. By the next morning, over 200 searchers fanned out across the area. Within days, that number swelled to over 1,000, and eventually close to 1,400 people were combing the mountain wilderness, including park rangers, college students, firefighters, Boy Scout troops, police officers, and even 60 Green Berets from the United States Army's Special Forces, who were called in to assist. Huey helicopters were dispatched from Warner Robins Air Force Base in Georgia. A base camp was established at Spence Field. The mountains were being turned inside out, looking for one small boy. But there was a devastating complication. Not long after Dennis vanished, a violent thunderstorm rolled in, dumping 3 inches of rain in a matter of hours. Trails were washed out, streams flooded, and any footprints Dennis might have left were obliterated. Temperatures that night dropped to nearly 50 degrees, and any scent trail the boy had left was either washed away or so degraded that tracking dogs, which were not deployed until the following day because of the storm, had almost nothing to follow. Retired park ranger Dwight McCarter, who spent years investigating the case, later expressed deep regret that the dogs were not used immediately. Even if the rain had washed away Dennis's initial scent, if the boy had continued to move after the storm, he would have been leaving a fresh trail. That opportunity was lost. There were footprints found in the area, child-sized prints that appeared to match the type of shoe Dennis had been wearing. A low-cut Oxford style. One print even suggested the child had lost a shoe and was walking with one bare foot. But park officials dismissed them, concluding they had been left by a Boy Scout participating in the search, even though none of the scouts were searching barefoot. A set of similar prints was later found near the west prong of the Pigeon River, miles from Spence Field. But again, investigators did not follow up on them with the seriousness they perhaps deserved. Then there was the sighting. A man named Harold Key, who was camping with his family near a creek called Rowan's Creek, which flows off the mountain several miles from Spence Field, told authorities that around 7 in the evening on June 14th, roughly an hour and a half after Dennis disappeared, he heard what he described as a sickening scream coming from the woods. About 3 minutes later, he saw a disheveled, unkempt man moving through the forest in the direction of the scream. The man appeared to be carrying something over his shoulder, and Key said the object was reddish in color, the same color as the t-shirt Dennis had been wearing that day. Park rangers and the FBI investigated Key's account, but ultimately determined there was insufficient evidence to connect the sighting to Dennis's disappearance. The distance between Spence Field and Key's location, roughly 5 to 7 miles by trail and through rugged backcountry, was considered too great for someone to have traveled in the available time. The search officially wound down on June 29, 1969, and was formally closed in September of that year. Not a single trace of Dennis Martin was ever found. No clothing, no remains, and no conclusive evidence of what happened. The case prompted a comprehensive review of search operations in the national parks, and the Park Service ultimately changed its protocols for missing persons searches, improvements that were born directly from the failures and lessons of the Dennis Martin search. But for the Martin family, none of that mattered. Their boy was gone. Over 50 years later, his case remains open and classified as unsolved. Dennis Martin's name still appears on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Registry. If he were alive today, he would be in his 60s. The Smokies would claim another soul just 7 years later, in what is one of the most perplexing disappearances in Tennessee history. On Friday, October 8th, 1976, a group of roughly 40 students from Bearden High School in Knoxville boarded a bus for a field trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. They were from a horticulture class, taught by a young teacher named Wayne Dunlap, and the plan was to hike the Forney Ridge Trail from the Klingman's Dome parking area down to Andrews Bald, a scenic stretch of high-elevation grasslands, about 1.8 miles each way. Among the students was 16-year-old Trenny Lynn Gibson, a sophomore with light brown hair and green eyes, who was, by all accounts, a normal teenager. She had a part-time job at a cafeteria in a local mall. She saved her earnings carefully, and she was described in Park Service records as a good student with no problems and in generally good health. She had little outdoor experience, though, and the weather that day was not exactly inviting. It was dark, overcast, and rainy, the kind of dreary autumn day in the Smokies that can turn the mountain trails slick and reduce visibility to almost nothing. The students hiked down to Andrews Bald and then turned around to head back. Along the way, the group fragmented, as groups of teenagers on school trips tend to do, splitting into smaller clusters, walking at different paces along the trail. Trenny was seen by several of her classmates at various points during the return hike. Around 2:50 in the afternoon, with the group about half a mile from the parking area, a few students stopped to rest. But Trenny kept going. One classmate later told investigators that Trenny seemed to be in a hurry to get back. Another thought she might have been trying to cut cross-country to reach the parking area by a shortcut. At 3:30 p.m., the group reassembled at the bus. But Trenny was not there. Several students and the teacher looked around the area, checking the restrooms and the observation tower, but there was no sign of her. She had simply vanished from a well-traveled trail in a national park, surrounded by dozens of other people on a Friday afternoon. A search was launched almost immediately and continued into the night despite the worsening weather. By the next day, a full-scale operation was underway, with search dogs, rangers, and volunteers fanning out across the area. The dogs picked up Trenny's scent on the Andrews Bald Trail and followed it toward the Forney Creek Trail, but there were no visible signs of her along the path. Another dog picked up her scent near the Clingman's Dome observation tower and followed it along the Appalachian Trail for roughly 1.5 miles before losing it at Clingman's Dome Road. This detail was crucial and deeply troubling because the road was accessible to vehicles, and the implication was clear. If the scent ended at a road, there was a possibility that Trenny had gotten into a car, whether willingly or by force. The search continued for weeks, stretching from October 8th through the end of October 1976. Hundreds of people were involved, and one account notes the need for 300 packed lunches to be delivered on a single day to feed the searchers. Investigators followed up on numerous reported sightings, including one of a girl resembling Trenny who traveled to Bryson City to get married, and another of a young woman who boarded a plane in Newark, New Jersey with a much older man. Over a dozen area hospitals were checked. None of these leads produced results. Some people noticed that tennis shoe tracks about the size of Trenny's appeared on the Appalachian Trail heading toward the Double Spring shelter, but they were lost about 1/2 mile past a key intersection. Beyond that, nothing. No clothing, no personal items, no sign of a struggle, no body. What makes this case particularly unsettling is the sheer number of people who were on or near the trail that afternoon. This was not a remote wilderness where a person could slip into isolation. There were 40 students on the trip. There were other groups of hikers both in front of and behind Trenny's group. And the Clingman's Dome parking area is one of the most heavily trafficked spots in the entire park. The trail itself was moderately steep, with sharp drop-offs and dense undergrowth on both sides, meaning that if someone stepped off the path, whether voluntarily or by force, they would have encountered immediate and difficult terrain. If Trenny had fallen or been injured, the search dog should have been able to locate her. If she had been taken by a wild animal, there would have been blood, torn clothing, some physical evidence. And if she had voluntarily left the trail, where could a 16-year-old girl with no money, no vehicle, and no outdoor experience have gone? The fact that the dogs tracked her scent to a road surface and then lost it has led many to conclude that Trenny Gibson left the park in a vehicle, which raises an entirely different and deeply disturbing set of questions about what happened to her and who she may have encountered. Trenny Gibson had walked ahead of her classmates on a 2-foot-wide gravel trail with dense undergrowth and sharp drop-offs on either side, and she was never seen again. Her case remains open with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. She would be 65 years old today, and the Smokies were not finished. 5 years after Trenny vanished, almost as if the mountains themselves had developed an appetite, another woman disappeared along one of the park's well-worn trails, this time under circumstances that were arguably even more baffling. Thelma Pauline Melton, who went by Polly, was 58 years old in the fall of 1981, and she was no stranger to the Great Smoky Mountains. She and her husband Robert, who was nearly 20 years her senior, split their time between Jacksonville, Florida, and a spot at the Deep Creek campground on the North Carolina side of the park, where they parked their Airstream trailer among a small, close-knit community of about 10 families. Polly had been hiking the Deep Creek Trail for almost 20 years and knew it intimately. She was a heavy-set woman, about 5 feet 11 inches tall, who suffered from high blood pressure and nausea and smoked about 2 packs of Virginia Slim cigarettes a day. She was not a picture of peak physical fitness, but she loved the outdoors, and she loved her routine. On September 25th, 1981, Polly set about a typical day. She made spaghetti sauce for that evening's dinner, took a short nap, and then headed out for an afternoon hike on the Deep Creek Trail with 2 of her friends, Trula Gudger and Pauline Cannon. Her husband stayed behind in the Airstream due to his age and health. The 3 women walked and chatted, poking fun at Polly about a man who had taken a liking to her at the nutrition center, where she volunteered serving meals to senior citizens. Polly brushed it off with a laugh. Around 4 in the afternoon, about an hour into the hike, the women reached the turnaround point and started heading back toward the campground. One side of the gravel trail ran along Deep Creek, which was shallow at the time due to a drought, and the other side was a steep ridge. They had walked about half a mile when Polly suddenly picked up her pace. She began walking faster than her friends had seen her walk in a long time, pulling ahead of them with surprising energy. One of her friends called out something like, "I wouldn't want to be in a foot race with you, Polly." Polly turned, laughed, and kept going. She crested a small hill on the trail and dropped out of sight on the other side. When her friends reached the top of that same hill, they expected to see Polly catching her breath on one of the public benches ahead. But the trail was empty. Polly was gone. Gudger and Cannon assumed Polly had hurried back to the campground, perhaps to check on Robert. But when they arrived around 4:30, Robert was inside the Airstream and said he had not seen Polly since she left for the hike. By 6 in the evening, Polly was reported missing to a park ranger. Search teams returned to the trail that evening and found nothing. No footprints leading off the path, no sign that anyone had ventured into the brush, and no trace of Polly Melton whatsoever. Polly had nothing with her when she disappeared besides her cigarettes. No money, no identification, and no medications. She was not carrying car keys because she had been barred from driving that summer for unclear reasons. Her husband's bottle of Valium was discovered to be missing after she vanished, though it was never confirmed that Polly had taken it. Her pastor mentioned that she had been struggling with depression following her mother's death earlier that year, and there was even an unsubstantiated suggestion that she might have been involved in an affair, though no evidence was found to support it. One strange detail surfaced months later. In April of 1982, A check written to Polly Melton was reportedly cashed in Birmingham, Alabama. But this lead, like everything else in the case, went nowhere. Search dogs were brought in, and they were unable to pick up Polly's scent on the trail, which baffled investigators. The ranger in charge of the search speculated that Polly might not have been in the park at all, but how a 58-year-old woman with health problems could have gotten out of a national park in the span of 30 minutes without a vehicle, without money, and without being seen by a single person on a popular trail remains one of the most haunting questions in Smoky Mountain lore. The Deep Creek Trail was not a remote backcountry path. It was a popular, well-maintained trail that ran parallel to the creek, and it was frequented by visitors throughout the day. For Polly to have simply disappeared from it, with her friends only minutes behind her, bordered on the physically impossible. If she had fallen into the creek, which was running shallow at the time due to drought, she would almost certainly have been visible. If she had climbed the steep ridge on the other side of the trail, it would have been an extraordinarily difficult feat for a woman of her size and physical condition, and the search teams found no evidence that anyone had disturbed the brush. The timing, too, was deeply strange. Polly had made spaghetti sauce that morning, suggesting she fully intended to return and cook dinner. She had not packed any belongings or taken any supplies. Everything about her day suggested a woman who expected to be home by evening, sitting down to a hot meal with her husband. And yet, in the span of less than 30 minutes, between the time her friends last saw her crest that hill and the time they arrived back at the campground, Polly Melton vanished as completely as if she had never existed. She has never been found. No clothing, no remains, and no credible sighting has ever surfaced. If she were alive, she would be over 100 years old. Now, let's leave the misty ridges of the Smokies and travel west to the towering peaks of Colorado, where, in the summer of 1958, a 10-year-old boy named Bobby Bizup vanished from a Catholic summer camp in the shadow of Rocky Mountain National Park. Bobby's story is one that was considered a simple tragedy for more than 60 years, but recent revelations have cast a far more disturbing light on what may have truly happened. Bobby was born almost completely deaf, the only child of Joe and Connie Bizup. Joe was stationed at Lowry Air Force Base in Denver, and that summer, Bobby was sent to Camp St. Malo, an all-boys Catholic camp near Allens Park in Boulder County. The camp sat on the southeastern edge of Rocky Mountain National Park, a beautiful setting surrounded by alpine meadows and the kind of rugged mountain terrain that could swallow a person whole. Bobby loved the camp and reportedly looked forward to his time there every year. On August 15th, 1958, something went wrong. According to the official story provided by the camp's director, Father Richard Heister, Bobby had been fishing that afternoon and failed to follow a counselor and other boys back to the main lodge for dinner. A search party went out that evening, and by the following day, hundreds of people were looking for the boy, aided by bloodhounds, aircraft, and search teams from the military, local police, and the National Park Service. They searched for days. The terrain was punishing, a labyrinth of steep slopes, rocky outcrops, and dense forest. But nothing was found. The search was eventually called off. Then, the following summer, in July of 1959, a group of hikers, 3 counselors, and a group of boys from Camp St. Malo were making their way up Mount Meeker, a peak that rises directly to the west of the camp. One of them stumbled upon a bone and a scrap of clothing on the mountain's eastern face. A more thorough search the following week turned up more bones, fragments of clothing, and a broken hearing aid. Authorities concluded that the remains belonged to Bobby Bizup, and that he had died from exhaustion and exposure. Case closed, or so everyone thought. The remains were found roughly 2,000 feet up the mountain, in an area that had already been searched during the initial operation the previous summer. How a 10-year-old deaf boy, confused and likely terrified, could have climbed 2,000 feet up the steep and treacherous face of Mount Meeker without being seen, heard, or leaving any trace until nearly a year later was a question that gnawed at some of the people involved, but it was never satisfactorily answered. What made the case even more unsettling is what emerged decades later, following the exposure of widespread sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. A 2019 investigation by Denver's 9 News uncovered that at least 2 of the counselors working at Camp St. Malo when Bobby disappeared, Neil Hewitt and Harold Robert White, went on to be credibly accused of sexually abusing multiple children during their careers as priests. White was described as a serial child sex abuser who molested at least 70 children over 2 decades. And Hewitt, crucially, was not just one of the last people to see Bobby alive. He was also the person who discovered Bobby's remains on Mount Meeker the following year. There were other troubling details. A boy at the camp with Bobby later recalled seeing him extremely upset and angry just before he disappeared. Staff members told park rangers a similar story, that something had severely distressed the boy immediately prior to his going missing. A former park ranger named Roger Contour, who was involved in the recovery of Bobby's remains, later said he had always had doubts about the accident theory. 2 other men involved in recovering the remains also came forward to question the official narrative. And then there was the skull. In 2021, 9 News reported that a skull believed to belong to Bobby had been in the possession of a Colorado family for decades, apparently kept by a friend of the priest who ran the camp. It was eventually turned over to authorities by a man who had inherited it from his father. In 2020, the National Park Service's Investigative Services Branch officially opened a criminal investigation into Bobby Bizup's disappearance and death, adding it to their cold case roster. As of the most recent updates, that investigation remains ongoing. The NPS Investigative Services Branch has asked anyone with information about Bobby Bizup's disappearance and death to submit a tip, and the case is listed on their official cold case page alongside other unsolved mysteries from the national parks. Neil Hewitt, when confronted by reporters, denied harming Bobby. Harold Robert White died in 2006, taking whatever he knew to his grave. From the mountains of Colorado, let us now travel to the granite cathedrals of Yosemite National Park in California, where in the summer of 1981, a teenage girl stepped off a trail and into oblivion, leaving behind nothing more than a single camera lens. Stacy Arras was 14 years old, the youngest of 4 children born to George and Carol Arras. In July of 1981, Stacy and her father George, along with 6 other people, embarked on a 4-day horseback riding trip through the backcountry of Yosemite, traveling along the High Sierra Camp Loop at Tuolumne Meadows. On July 17th, the group rode about 4 miles along the John Muir Trail, stopped for a late lunch at the Upper Cathedral Lakes area, and then continued on to the Sunrise High Sierra Camp, the last stop on the 50-mile High Sierra Camp Loop. The camp sat at 9,400 feet above sea level, set against a stunning alpine meadow with views of Mount Florence and Mount Clark. It consisted of 9 small cabins that could accommodate up to 34 guests, with no electricity or running water. After arriving and settling into a cabin she shared with her father, Stacy freshened up, changed her clothes, put on a pair of sandals, grabbed her camera, and told her dad she wanted to walk down the trail toward the lake to take some photographs. George, tired from the ride, declined to go with her. A 71-year-old man from their group, Gerald Stewart, offered to walk along. The two headed down the trail together, but Gerald quickly grew tired and sat down to rest. The trail guide, who was working at the corral nearby, noticed Stacy standing on a rock about 50 yards south of the trail. That was the last time anyone saw Stacy Arras. When Stacy did not return after a while, Gerald made his way back to the camp and alerted the others. A search of the immediate area began, and the group quickly found a single camera lens on the trail, which was later confirmed to belong to Stacy's camera. Nothing else was found. The National Park Service launched a formal 9-day search that involved as many as 150 people, including 67 Mountain Rescue Association volunteers, search dogs, and helicopters, covering a 3 to 5 square mile area around Sunrise Lake. The dogs were unable to pick up any scent due to dry and dusty conditions. Not one additional piece of evidence was ever recovered. No clothing, no footprints, no sign of a struggle, and no body. Some people familiar with the area have pointed out a discrepancy in the official account. The report states that Stacy was walking toward the lake, which was supposedly visible from the camp. But those who have worked and lived in Yosemite have noted that there is no lake in direct sight of the Sunrise High Sierra camp. If Stacy was indeed heading to the nearest lake, the actual distance would have been considerable, taking her well beyond the view of anyone at the camp and into more remote and treacherous terrain filled with crevices, drop-offs, and hidden hazards that could easily conceal a fall. The case file for Stacy Arras is reportedly over 2,000 pages long, which is extraordinarily large for a missing persons case. Most such files are between 10 and 100 pages. The National Park Service has classified it as a criminal investigation, and author David Paulides, who has written extensively about disappearances in national parks as part of his Missing 411 series, has been denied access to the file through multiple Freedom of Information Act requests. One park ranger reportedly told Paulides regarding the file, "You'll never see it." Whether this secrecy is a matter of protecting an ongoing criminal investigation or something else entirely remains unclear. George Arras passed away in 2003, and Carol died before him. As of today, Stacy Ann Arras remains listed as a missing person with the National Park Service. She would be in her late 50s now, and the mystery of what happened to her in the fading afternoon light of a Yosemite summer day remains completely unsolved. In 2017, the National Park Service reported that 33 people have gone missing from Yosemite since 1909. Stacy was the only person to vanish from the Sunrise area, and the only one to disappear from the park between 1978 and 1985. Whatever happened to her was singular, isolated, and devastating. The 14-year-old girl who walked down a trail with a camera to photograph a lake walked straight into the void, and the park has never given her back. There is something uniquely haunting about the Grand Canyon. Its scale is almost incomprehensible. A chasm carved over millions of years that stretches 277 miles long, up to 18 miles wide, and over a mile deep. It is a place that dwarfs every human endeavor, and in 1928, it swallowed 2 newlyweds who were chasing a dream and were never seen again. Glen Hyde was 29 years old, an Idaho farm boy, an experienced boat builder who had already navigated the Salmon and Snake Rivers. His wife, Bessie Louise Hyde, was 22, an aspiring artist and poet, a bohemian soul who had met Glen on a passenger ship traveling to Los Angeles in 1927. The two married on April 12, 1928, and for their honeymoon, they hatched an audacious plan. They would build a boat, a 20-foot wooden sweep scow, and run the entire length of the Green and Colorado rivers through the Grand Canyon. Glen wanted to set a new speed record for the journey, and Bessie would make history as the first documented woman to complete the run. On October 20th, 1928, the Hydes launched their scow, which they had named Rain in the Face, from Green River, Utah. By all accounts, the first several weeks went well, though the trip was not without its dangers. Early on, Glen was thrown from the boat in rough rapids, a reminder of the river's lethal power. Notably, neither of them wore life jackets. On November 16th, the couple hiked out of the canyon via the Bright Angel Trail on the south rim to resupply. While there, they visited the studio of Emery Kolb, a legendary photographer who lived and worked on the canyon's rim and who knew the river perhaps better than anyone alive. Kolb photographed the young couple and invited them to stay for a meal. During their visit, Kolb was struck by Bessie's demeanor. She seemed tired and reluctant to return to the water, perhaps exhausted from the journey or fearful of the rapids that lay ahead. Kolb warned the couple about the dangers downstream and noted their lack of life preservers. Glen reportedly laughed it off. As the couple prepared to leave, Kolb's young daughter came out to say goodbye. Bessie admired the girl's dress and said something that, in hindsight, feels like a premonition. "I wonder if I shall ever wear pretty shoes again," she reportedly sighed. On November 18, 1928, Glen and Bessie Hyde were last seen boating away downriver below Hermit Rapid. That was the last confirmed sighting of either of them. When they failed to arrive in Needles, California by their expected date of December 6th, Glen's father, Rollin Hyde, organized a search. A plane was dispatched to search the river from the air, and on December 19th, the search aircraft spotted the Hyde scow floating near river mile 237. It was upright. It was fully intact. The supplies were still strapped in. Bessie's diary was tucked safely inside, along with her camera. But Glen and Bessie were nowhere to be found. There were no tracks leading away from the boat, no signs of disturbance on the riverbank, and no bodies downstream. It was as though they had simply evaporated. Bessie's diary contained a final entry, dated around November 30th, placing the couple near Diamond Creek, around river mile 225 to 231. Historian Otis Doc Marston later made a compelling case that the couple were most likely swept overboard when their scow struck submerged rocks in a particularly brutal stretch of rapids near river mile 232, a section of river littered with granite boulders just beneath the surface that had damaged, snared, or capsized more boats than any other location on the Colorado. This theory remains the most widely accepted explanation. But the story does not end there. In 1971, an elderly woman on a commercial Grand Canyon rafting trip casually announced to her fellow travelers that she was Bessie Hyde. She claimed that Glen had become abusive during the trip and that she had stabbed him to death and hiked out of the canyon to start a new life. The woman later recanted the story. Then, when famed Grand Canyon river runner Georgie Clark died in May of 1992, her friends entered her home for the first time and made startling discoveries. Her birth certificate listed her real name as Bessie DeRoss. More chillingly, among her belongings were the marriage license of Glen and Bessie Hyde, and a pistol hidden in her lingerie drawer. Investigators eventually determined that Clark's early life was well documented and that she was not Bessie Hyde, but the finds deepened the aura of mystery that has clung to this case for nearly a century. In 1976, skeletal remains of a young man with a bullet lodged in his skull were found on property belonging to Emery Kolb, the photographer who was among the last to see the Hydes alive. For a time, there was speculation this could be Glen, but forensic analysis determined the remains belonged to a man no older than 22, who had died no earlier than 1972. Glen and Bessie Hyde have never been found. Their story remains one of the most romanticized and debated mysteries in Grand Canyon history, the subject of multiple books, documentaries, an NPR feature, and even a musical. Nearly a century later, the Colorado River still keeps its secret, and every so often, when a commercial rafting group makes camp near Diamond Creek, and the guide tells the story of two honeymooners who sailed into the canyon and never sailed out, someone around the fire will look out at the dark water and wonder what the river took, and whether it will ever give it back. Returning to Colorado, but this time to the rugged wilderness west of Fort Collins, brings us to one of the most heartbreaking and contentious cases in the missing 411 canon. On October 2nd, 1999, 3-year-old Jared Atadero vanished from the Big South Trail in the Comanche Peak Wilderness area of the Roosevelt National Forest, and what followed was a nightmare that haunted his father for the rest of his life. Jared and his 6-year-old sister Josalyn were staying with their father Alan at the Poudre River Resort, a commercial lodge owned by Alan and his twin brother Arlen, about 60 miles west of Fort Collins. That weekend, a Christian Singles Network group was staying at the resort, and Alan gave permission for his children to accompany the group on what he believed was a short trip to a nearby state fish hatchery, about 1.5 miles from the resort. What Alan did not know was that the group of 11 adults, along with his 2 children, decided instead to hike the Big South Trail, a rugged 11-mile path at over 8,000 feet in elevation that cut deep into the wilderness. It was one of those gorgeous fall bluebird days in the Colorado mountains, the kind that makes you forget how dangerous these places can be. As the group hiked, they split into faster and slower walkers, a common occurrence on group outings that would prove catastrophic. Jared, a lively and curious boy full of energy, ran about 100 feet ahead of the slower group and stopped to chat with 2 fishermen along the trail. He reportedly asked them if there were bears in the woods, a question the fishermen later recalled because it seemed precocious for a toddler. After the brief conversation, Jared continued down the trail, moving ahead of the adults. That was the last time anyone saw him. When the group realized Jared was missing, panic set in quickly. Alan, who was back at the resort, raced to the trailhead when he got word. He was certain he would find his son. He yelled Jared's name along the trail, fully expecting the boy to come running out of the woods at the sound of his father's voice. But Jared did not appear. A massive search was launched that evening, eventually becoming one of the largest search and rescue operations in Larimer County history. Over 200 volunteers, professional trackers, a dozen dog teams, a water dive team, a search plane, and law enforcement officials from multiple agencies spent a week combing the area. During the search, a helicopter carrying searchers from Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming crashed along the trail after flying too low over the river, injuring those on board. The search lasted 6 grueling days. Nothing was found. There were tantalizing leads. Trackers found what they believed were mountain lion prints alongside tiny footprints on the trail. At the point where the 2 sets of prints converged, the child's footprints disappeared. But there were also reported sightings of Jared from across the country, including one from a ranger at Mesa Verde National Park, who said a little boy kept running up to him wanting to hold his hand, a personality trait that Allen recognized as distinctly Jared's. The ranger recalled that the boy was accompanied by a man who called him something that sounded like Gerald. Despite what the family considered a credible lead, it was not pursued with urgency by authorities. For nearly 4 years, there were no answers. Then, on June 4th, 2003, 2 hikers from Fort Collins stumbled upon something that 200 trained searchers, dogs, and technology had missed. On a steep 45-degree slope, approximately 500 feet above the trail, and more than a mile from where Jared had disappeared, they found children's clothing scattered across a 25-foot area. A fleece pullover, a pair of sweatpants, and a pair of Tarzan sneakers, Jared's shoes. The clothing was torn, and the fleece had what appeared to be puncture marks, but the nylon sneakers showed remarkably little wear, with no sign of having been dragged. Even more puzzling, the pants were turned inside out. A subsequent search of the area on June 14th recovered a piece of a child's skull and a tooth. DNA testing confirmed the remains were Jared's. The death certificate listed the cause of death as undetermined, with a probable mountain lion attack. But Jared's father was never convinced. He pointed out that a mountain lion would typically attack the stomach first, yet Jared's sweater showed no such damage. The inside-out pants were difficult to explain by any animal attack, and the location of the remains, 500 feet up a near vertical slope, far above and away from the trail, seemed an unlikely place for a mountain lion to drag its prey, especially given that the shoes showed no signs of dragging. What a team of 200-plus searchers missed, 2 casual hikers found by chance nearly 4 years later. Allen Atadero channeled his grief into advocacy, becoming a driving force behind bringing the Amber Alert system to Colorado and pushing for Recreational Safety Awareness Week, which was declared by Governor Bill Ritter in Jared's honor. Allen kept Jared's bedroom exactly as the boy had left it, and on the shelves, alongside his favorite toys and belongings, he placed the fragment of his son's skull. "This is all I have of him," he told reporters. The Big South Trail was renamed the Jared Atadero Legacy Trail, with a permanent sign at the trailhead listing safety tips for children. No one was ever charged in connection with Jared's death. The mystery of what happened on that beautiful fall day in the Colorado wilderness remains unsolved. The official theory, a mountain lion attack, is the one most widely accepted by law enforcement, but it has never satisfied those who have studied the case closely. Mountain lion tracks were found converging with small footprints on the trail during the initial search, and Colorado is no stranger to big cat encounters. But the condition and placement of the remains raised more questions than they answered. How did clothing end up 500 feet above a trail on a near vertical slope without showing signs of being dragged? Why were the pants inside out? How did 2 casual hikers stumble upon what a massive organized search operation could not find? These questions do not have easy answers, and for Allen Atadero, the father who spent 2 decades searching for his son, they never will. "I am at peace," he said in a later interview, "and I know I am going to see Jared again one of these days. I'm going to look at him and say, 'Jared, what happened?' And he's going to look at me and say, 'Dad, does it really matter?'" Shifting now to the arid desert of southeastern Arizona, we come to a case that stands alone in National Park Service history, the disappearance of the only park ranger to ever vanish and never be found. On the afternoon of Sunday, January 13th, 1980, Paul Braxton Fugate, a 41-year-old naturalist ranger at Chiricahua National Monument, told a seasonal aide that he was going to check the nature trail and stepped out of the visitor center. He was wearing his standard green and gray Park Service uniform, including the official NPS arrowhead patch on his upper sleeve, a gold-colored ranger badge pinned over his heart, Red Wing hiking boots, and a green down parka. He walked toward one of the park's trails. He was never seen again. Chiricahua National Monument sprawls over 12,000 acres of complex terrain in Cochise County, a landscape of volcanic rock formations, steep canyons, arroyos, and dense brush that shares 80 miles of border with Mexico. In 1980, the area was just beginning to be used as a corridor for drug trafficking from across the border, and illegal activity was a daily occurrence in the vicinity. Paul Fugate was intimately familiar with this landscape. He had worked there for years, leading visitors through the dramatic rock spires and hidden canyons. He was fit, cautious, and experienced. He knew the trails by heart. When Paul did not return that evening, a search was launched. Over the following days and weeks, teams from the National Park Service, the Cochise County Sheriff's Office, local volunteers, and military personnel combed the monument's rugged backcountry. They searched thousands of acres of punishing terrain. They found absolutely nothing. No footprints in the soft soil, no clothing snagged on brush, no sign of a struggle, and no remains. Paul's truck sat at the trailhead with his lunch half-eaten inside. Back at his on-site cabin, investigators found his wallet, $300 in cash, a valuable gun collection, expensive camera equipment, and a truck he had been restoring. Everything indicated that Paul Fugate had left the visitor center, expecting to return within a couple of hours. There was one tantalizing lead. An acquaintance of Paul's, while driving on the road out of the monument on the afternoon of the disappearance, claimed to have seen Paul in the passenger seat of an unfamiliar dark green pickup truck with a camper shell. Under hypnosis weeks later, the witness described the driver as a man in his 30s with a Kenny Rogers-style beard, wearing a black, white, and red plaid shirt. A second man in the truck appeared to be wearing a green jacket that matched one Paul had taken with him from the visitor center. Paul, according to the witness, looked sad and dejected. Park Service officials dismissed this account due to the speed at which the two vehicles had passed each other, but other monument employees reportedly saw vehicle spin-out tracks on a dirt road near a location called the Faraway Ranch, along with signs of a scuffle. The case took a bitter turn when Howard Chapman, director of the Park Service's Western Region, reviewed the file in early 1981 and decided that Fugate had voluntarily abandoned his position. Paul was dismissed from his role, and his wife, Dodie, was asked to return nearly $7,000 in payments she had received, plus 11% interest. For 6 years, the National Park Service refused to list Paul as deceased, and Dodie was unable to collect survivors' benefits. It was not until 1986, when a thorough re-examination of the case confirmed that Paul was almost certainly dead, that the agency reversed course and Dodie's benefits were finally approved. Foul play has been suspected from the beginning. Over the decades, anonymous tips, letters, and alleged confessions have surfaced. One letter to investigators named a prison inmate as someone who claimed to have helped dispose of a park ranger. In 2014, a female Park Service employee named Karen Gonzalez was assaulted and nearly killed near the very same Faraway Ranch by an alleged drug smuggler from Mexico, underscoring the danger that has always permeated this border area. Human bones have turned up in the surrounding Coronado National Forest on separate occasions. In 2018, the National Park Service tripled the reward in the case to $60,000 after new information came to light, though the specifics of that information have not been publicly disclosed. Paul Fugate remains the only National Park Service ranger to disappear and never be accounted for. His name is on the Park Service's cold case list, and his wife Dodie, well into her late 70s, has never stopped searching for answers. She still lives in a small home outside Santa Fe, and on the back of a chair inside hangs a pair of jeans and a wrinkled work shirt, Paul's street clothes, the ones he would have changed into after finishing his shift on that January afternoon. They have been there for over 4 decades, waiting for a man who is never coming home. Dodie once told a reporter, "For a long time, I went into another dimension. I went nuts." Paul Fugate's case is the longest-running missing person investigation in Arizona state history, and it is the oldest open case for a missing staff member in the entire National Park Service. Someone knows what happened to him. Someone has always known. And the desert, like the man it consumed, has kept its silence. Let us end with a case that bends the very idea of what is possible, the kind of story that makes even hardened skeptics pause and wonder. In the spring of 1952, a 2-year-old boy named Keith Parkins was visiting his grandfather's cattle ranch near Ritter, Oregon, a remote community surrounded by the forests of the Blue Mountains in the vicinity of the Umatilla National Forest. On April 10th, Keith was playing outside near a barn on the property with his older brothers. At some point, the older boys headed back to the house for lunch, leaving Keith at the barn. When their mother realized Keith had not come inside with his brothers, she went to the barn to collect him. He was gone. A search began immediately. They could follow his tiny footprints in the dirt and snow up to a certain point. But then the tracks simply stopped. There were no other footprints nearby, no adult tracks, and no animal tracks. It was as though the boy had been plucked from the earth. A massive search party was organized, and the effort went on through the night, a dangerous undertaking given the plummeting temperatures and the harsh winter conditions that still gripped the area. The terrain surrounding the ranch was brutal, a sprawling wilderness of mountain ridges, creeks, rivers, barbed wire fences, and dense forest. It was no place for a toddler alone in the cold. 19 hours later, searchers found Keith. He was lying face down on the surface of a frozen pond, roughly 12 miles away from the ranch through some of the most difficult terrain in the region. His jacket had been removed, despite the freezing temperatures, and his clothes were ripped and torn, though he bore no visible physical injuries. He was unconscious, but alive. The route between the ranch and the frozen pond would have required crossing 2 mountain ranges, traversing barbed wire fences, and fording creeks and rivers. For an adult in good health, 12 miles of that kind of terrain in 19 hours would be a demanding physical feat. For a 2-year-old, it was considered by many to be flatly impossible. When Keith was revived and cared for, he was unable or unwilling to explain what had happened. He said he did not remember. Years later, as an adult, Keith Parkins was interviewed for the Missing 411 documentary series, and his answer was the same. He had no memory of the event. He could not explain how he got from the barn to the frozen pond, how he survived the freezing temperatures without his jacket, or who or what might have carried him across 12 miles of wilderness. Whatever happened to Keith Parkins in those 19 hours in the Oregon backcountry, it left no physical trace and no mental imprint. He was simply gone, and then he was found, impossibly far away, impossibly alive, with no explanation that anyone could offer. Survival expert Les Stroud, known from his television show Survivorman, filmed a segment for a Missing 411 documentary in which he attempted to demonstrate just how impossible Keith's journey would have been. He concluded that there was no rational explanation for how a 2-year-old could have covered that distance, in that terrain, in that weather, in that amount of time. The removal of the jacket is consistent with a well-documented phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, which occurs during the later stages of hypothermia when the body's temperature regulation fails and the person feels an irrational sensation of burning heat, leading them to strip off their clothing. But paradoxical undressing does not explain the distance traveled. Keith Parkins survived, but the questions surrounding his ordeal have never been answered. These are the stories that linger long after the campfire burns out. The boy in the red shirt who walked behind a bush and ceased to exist. The teenager who hurried ahead of her classmates and vanished from a gravel trail. The woman who crested a hill and was never seen on the other side. The deaf child whose bones were found high on a mountain he should never have been able to climb. The newlyweds whose perfectly intact boat floated down the Colorado without them. The toddler who was carried 12 miles through the wilderness by something no one can name. These are the people the parks will not give back. And if you listen carefully to the wind moving through the trees on your next hike, you might just hear them still. If you found these stories as fascinating and chilling as I did, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it means we can keep bringing you these deep dives into the unexplained. I'll see you in the next one. Sleep well.